breathtaking achievement, epitomized by one of the iconic features of the line, the spectacular 11.7 kilometers long士崴Bridge, the longest permafrost bridge in the world. The permafrost problem was finally conquered. In all, over 160 kilometers of the Qinghai-Tibet Railway is built on bridges like this, 1/7 of the whole route. But permafrost was not the only formidable natural challenge of the plateau. The terrain is so high that it is deficient in one of the basic ingredients for life. Up here, you battle to stay alive. With an average altitude of 4,500 meters, the Tibetan plateau is unsurprisingly very sparsely populated. About a third of the way across the plateau, the Tibetan town of Totowa has a population of 1,300. The locals have adapted to living at high altitude over hundreds of years. But for anyone else, it's a serious hazard. Up here, breathing is much harder than at sea level. Despite that handicap, Pasi is taking on the local pool champion to demonstrate. Air is mainly made up of molecules of nitrogen and oxygen. About 1 in 5 molecules is oxygen. At sea level, there are plenty of molecules of both nitrogen and oxygen in every breath we take. But the higher you go, those molecules get fewer and fewer.
At 4,700 meters, where I am now, the amount of oxygen in the air is almost half of that at the sea level.
Here, the body finds it very hard to get enough oxygen out of the air, into the blood and to the muscles where it's needed. The harder we work, the more oxygen our bodies need. And if we don't get enough, it can be fatal. In severe cases, fluids can leak into your lungs and brain and kill you. As the Lhasa Express travels over the plateau, one of the most important jobs for the crew is to keep an eye on the passengers. They're looking for signs of altitude sickness. The train is now traveling at 4,500 meters above sea level. Medical advice recommends you should take 5 days to climb to this altitude to allow time to acclimatize. The train has done it in just 32 hours. At this altitude, around 3/4 of people start to experience altitude sickness.
I can feel that the air is very thin. When I was taking pictures, even slight movements made me feel breathless.
Since Chunar River, I've started to feel dizzy and sick. My nose feels very dry, and so does my child's. He has also complained of tummy ache.
To reduce these symptoms, remember those special oxygen generators. They fill the carriages with enriched air. The oxygen generators inside each carriage use a technique called membrane separation. Air from outside the train is compressed and pumped through small tubes. The walls of those tubes are made of a membrane containing small holes, which allow more of the smaller oxygen molecules to pass than the larger nitrogen. The unwanted nitrogen is exhausted from the train via an outlet pipe, while the oxygen-enriched air is fed into the carriages. It raises the level in the air from 21% to 24%. It's not much, but it makes most people feel better. But for people who are really suffering, there is a backup system. The staff give afflicted passengers a tube, which they can plug directly into a supply of 40% oxygen. Every berth and seat on the train has its own oxygen supply. The train is not pressurized like an aircraft cabin, but the doors are sealed to keep the oxygen-enriched atmosphere inside, and there's a very slight positive pressure, so the air outside can't seep in. By comparison, For the workers who built the track, conditions on the plateau were a living hell. Hard physical labor at this altitude is not only difficult, it's dangerous.
I really feel quite fragile up here at the plateau. I have a bit of a headache, and even though I'm walking at less than regular pace, I'm completely out of breath.
Many of the 3,000 workers who died building the first road into Tibet in the 1950s died from altitude sickness. And the railway engineers were keen not to repeat the disaster. But they needed extreme structures to be built at extreme altitudes, including one in particular.
I just had to see this. This is the highest railway tunnel in the world.
At 4,905 meters above sea level, the Chinese called the Fenghuoshan Tunnel the nearest door to heaven.
I can't even imagine what people who built this had to go through. We are at the 4,900 meters and there's not a lot of oxygen, so it had to be literally a headache to build it.
Building this tunnel required hundreds of laborers to live and work at this extreme altitude. So the railway company brought in one of China's leading experts on high-altitude medicine, Professor Tianyi Wu, head of the Qinghai Highland Medical and Scientific Research Center. His mission was to help the engineers build the tunnel and other high-altitude structures without the tragic loss of life of the 1950s road construction.
During the initial building of the Tibetan Railway, as most of the workers were from regions around sea level, they were not adapted to the highlands.
Aware of the dangers of rapid ascent, Professor Wu prepared a careful plan.
Our first measure was a stepwise adaptation, which meant letting them ascend gradually. So from inland, after the journey from Beijing to Xining, they'd stop for 3 days, and then a week stop at Golmud, then ascend to the Tangula Mountains.
Professor Wu was supported by a vast team of 2,000 doctors and nurses. Infirmaries were built every 18 kilometers along the route to treat sick workers. And Professor Wu made sure there was a good supply of oxygen.
So despite having over 1,000 cases of severe high-altitude illness over the 5 years, no one died. The mortality rate was 0.
Thanks to the onboard oxygen supply, the crew and passengers on the Lhasa Express are travelling in relative safety. But as they cross the plateau, their lives depend on another critical safety system. To save money, the line was built as a single track, but that brings with it a constant danger. If 2 trains travelling in opposite directions are accidentally routed onto the same line, there could be a head-on collision. But to control the trains, there are no signals. Instead, alongside the track, every 15 or so kilometers, there's a mobile phone antenna that passes information between the train and the control center, 2,300 kilometers away. Along the route, there are crossing loops, short sections of double track where trains can pass each other. 39 hours into its journey, the Lhasa Express is approaching one of these passing points. Tangula, the highest railway station in the world. It's a ghostly place. The station is simply a passing point for trains. It's early afternoon, and the train is still 500 kilometers from Lhasa. Inside, the passengers are protected from the extreme environment outside. But while the train protects the passengers from the environment, it must also do the reverse. It has to protect the fragile ecosystem of this ancient landscape from human pollution. The Tibetan Plateau contains the Kakashili and Sangjingyuan Nature Reserve, the second largest nature reserve in the world. It's larger than England and Wales combined. It's a delicate ecosystem that could be easily disrupted and destroyed. On most trains around the world, sewage and wastewater are dumped straight onto the track. But not here. The heat from all that water would warm the permafrost and degrade it. It would destroy the very foundations the train runs on. So the Chinese have gone green. Instead of dumping wastewater on the track, the Lhasa Express stores it in collection tanks below each carriage. Each tank holds 500 litres of wastewater, enough for 250 toilet flushes. Every night, at Golmud Station, a small fleet of mini-tankers drives along one of the platforms. At 11:45 p.m, the Lhasa Express's sister train, the T28 from Lhasa, pulls in on its way to Beijing. After crossing the plateau, the train's tanks are full of wastewater. A small army of workers leaps into action. They attach hoses to the tanks and pump the wastewater out. The whole operation takes less than 10 minutes. As the train leaves the station, the tankers head off to dispose of the waste safely. And 900 relieved passengers head off to Beijing. Passy is impressed by the efforts to conserve this fragile ecosystem. But in his trip across the plateau, he's discovered that all is not quite right with the railway. The line itself is still under threat.